Hello and welcome to lecture number 22. This is topic 2.11, the Stono Rebellion and Fort Mose. There's only one learning objective, which is to explain the key effects of the asylum offered by Spanish Florida in the 17th and 18th centuries. We'll start with the colony at St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied settlement in the United States. It's established by the Spanish in 1565, and it was constructed partially with the help of Africans. It was originally founded by Spanish Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles. By 1746, nearly a third of the population was black. Into the 18th century, the Spanish continued to use St. Augustine as a military defense and a way to maintain their claims on Florida, which was one of their further settlements from their seat of power in Mexico City, and also most at risk of being taken over by a European rival. St. Augustine's Castillo de San Marcos, a massive stone fortress, was constructed by 1672 to help defend the city. In the 17th century, enslaved refugees escaping from the Carolinas fled to St. Augustine. This may seem like a long distance to travel, but up until the early 1700s, the colony of Georgia did not exist, so the next neighboring territory was South Carolina to Spanish Florida. These enslaved refugees sought asylum in Spanish Florida because the Spanish offered them freedom if they converted to Catholicism, hence why the black population was so large. Spanish Florida's policy of offering asylum to escaped slaves was partially a strategic move to weaken English colonies. A lot of the free black population in St. Augustine lived in a settlement just outside St. Augustine called Fort Mose. The governor of Spanish Florida established it in 1738 and placed a formerly enslaved man named Francisco Menendez in charge of it. Menendez had been enslaved in the Carolinas and had fought against the English in the Yamasee War. That was a conflict between British settlers of South Carolina and various Native American tribes. Later, he escaped to St. Augustine, joined the Spanish militia there, and was eventually promoted to the rank of captain. Afterwards, he was put in charge of Fort Mose. It was the first ancient free black town in what is now the United States and was intended to be part of the defense against British incursions. Notice how it's just outside the city of St. Augustine and could provide the first line of defense against any attack. And it only had about 100 inhabitants. The Stono Rebellion took place in September 1739 in South Carolina, just outside Charleston. It was a slave uprising led by a man named Jemmy, who was from the Angola region. The Stono Rebellion is the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies prior to the American Revolution. Jemmy was able to get about 100 other enslaved people to join him, and they set fire to plantations and started to march towards Spanish Florida to gain sanctuary. They killed about 30 white people, but were eventually defeated by a white militia. Many of the people who followed Jemmy were enslaved people from the Kingdom of Congo, so they were Portuguese speakers and would have been familiar with Catholicism. The Kingdom of Congo had a long history of interaction with Portuguese explorers and missionaries dating back to the late 15th century. This explains why they may have been so motivated to go to Spanish Florida, aside from the fact that they would have already met the requirement to convert to Catholicism and therefore would have been emancipated as soon as they got there. After the rebellion was put down, South Carolina passed restrictive slave codes the following year. They made it illegal for enslaved Africans to move abroad, assemble in groups, raise food, earn money, or learn to write. They were trying to limit the amount of freedom enslaved people could have to prevent anyone from planning another insurrection. They also tried to limit the number of enslaved people in the colonies in proportion to the white population, prescribing a 1-to-10 ratio on every plantation. This meant that for every one white person, there could not be more than 10 enslaved people, lest they attempt to start another insurrection. It also gave permission to kill rebellious enslaved people, with impunity for anyone who did so. These restrictive slave codes were part of a broader trend across the American colonies to tighten control over enslaved populations following uprisings. British colonial forces invaded Florida 1 month later and eventually seized and destroyed Fort Mose. The Spanish rebuilt it in 1752, but Florida was given up to Britain by Spain at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict that affected Europe, North America, Central America, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. The black population that was left at Fort Mose either fled to Cuba with the rest of the Spanish soldiers or joined the Seminole Indian Nation. The Seminole Nation included many runaway slaves who found refuge among them, forming what was known as Black Seminoles. Finally, here's the recap. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied settlement of African and European origin in the United States and provided asylum to enslaved refugees. Fort Mose was the first sanctioned free black town in what is now the United States. The Stono Rebellion started in South Carolina, and its leaders intended to flee to Florida. The rebellion led to harsher slave codes and the British invasion of Florida. Fort Mose remains an important symbol of freedom and resistance against oppression and is now a National Historic Landmark. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.